Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to the monthly OGKC meeting. I am Brenda Dewberry, one of the co-presidents of the organization. We thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We're asking caregivers to put your name and email in the chat to be eligible to receive a $50 gift certificate at the end of this event. Today's topic is triggers by the Board of Developmental Disabilities. Certificates of attendance will be provided to anyone who would like one. Please submit your name to Barbara Turpin if you would like to receive a certificate. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter today. Her meeting topic is Understanding the Link Between Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs, and Lead Poisoning. The work of the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition is to educate, advocate for, and empower the community. The efforts are to prevent ACEs before they happen, educate the community, and seek policy changes. Many kinship families are caught in a balancing act of trying to manage children that have experienced a traumatic life experience and the adults who are still haunted by some of the traumatic experiences of their youth. We must work together to create the conditions for strong, thriving families and communities where all children and youth are free from harm. The objectives of our presenter today is to define ACEs and lead poisoning, to identify overlapping health issues that frequently coexist and compound each other's negative effects on child's development, and to explain the factors that indicate that children who experience ACEs are more likely to be exposed to lead. To lead. Our presenter, Ivanka Hall, is a director of the National is a excuse me. Ivanka is the director of a nationally recognized Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition. She received a master's in public administration from Texas Southern University and a bachelor's of arts from Notre Dame College. She is a proud John Marshall High School graduate of Cleveland, Ohio, and a 2019 inductee into the Alumni Hall of Fame. The Cleveland Plain Dealer named her the homegrown hero of her work addressing food insecurity during the pandemic. The significance of her life, leadership, and accomplishments are selected for the History Makers Archives for the Library of Congress, which recognizes notable African Americans. The 1974 murder of her mother, Yvonne Boston Hall, dramatically changed her life. Her childhood promise was to use her life to help others, lead and create cutting edge programs, and has impacted thousands of people's lives. She was named as 100 Women in America to Know. She is a mother, grandmother, and activist deeply passionate and involved in social justice activities locally and nationally. Please welcome Ms. Hall.
Good morning. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to share my screen so I can get started and we can get started here. Let's see. I think everybody should see the screen. Am I correct? All right. So again, I am Ivanka Hall. For me, I define myself as an advocate, an activist, and an agitator. Most of all, agitator. Like for me, it's important for us to agitate systems in order for those systems to actually do what they're supposed to do. And so if they're designed to protect and they're not protecting, then you go in and you make them do what you need them to do. I appreciate the opportunity from the Ohio Grandparent Kinship Coalition to bring me in. My work for the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition, which is now the Northeast Ohio Community Resilience Center, because of this whole thing around government funding and government subsidies and like who gets what. But Black and health are two of the words that could not be used. Um, and so our work in the coalition is to address the social, structural, environmental, and behavioral determinants of health in communities of concern. And how do we do that? We do that by working to educate, forgive the misspelling, educate, advocate for, and empower. We talked about this whole definition of what we looked at as being our objectives for the day, making sure that we're defining ACEs, which I've done in the past, but kind of adding this whole thing around this connection between ACEs and lead poisoning, looking at these public health issues and how they kind of overlap when we talk about like ACEs diagnosis and lead poisoning, looking at risk factors and then looking at how looking to ACEs and looking at this the lead and crime hypothesis being directly tied to ACEs. And so we kind of talked about these efforts when we talked about this introduction. And then we talked about why it's important for us to understand the role of racism, COVID, 19, the social determinants of health when seeking solutions. Many families, kinship families particularly, are caught in this kind of balancing act of trying to manage children that have experienced traumatic life experiences and adults who are still haunted by traumatic experiences of their youth. And when we think about that, we have lots of adults who are impacted. And so, what must be done? We must work to create a condition of strong, thriving families and communities where all children and youth are free from harm. And so, if you have been watching the news, you've seen some of the things that have gone on yesterday, where there was a young man, 31 years old, who murdered in two different households, murdered 8 children, and they were his. And one child was able to get away, but also shot 2 females. And so I actually want to look back at that at some point and kind of see, is ACEs one of the things that had gone on within that because that was a domestic violence situation. And so looking at those things. And so when we talk about ACEs, we talk about being defined as a traumatic event that happened to children between the ages of 1 and 17. These negative experiences affect the child's brain and health as they grow into adults. And so we know that ACEs can lead to mental health or chronic health conditions. Um, but according to the National Library of Medicine, for which I'm part of their advisory team, ACEs disproportionately impacts African Americans because of the profound subjection to historical systemic oppression, in addition to personal and intergenerational trauma and exposure. So when we talk about this, we talk about like this whole history of communities that have been subjected to oppression. So when we talk about Black and Brown communities and the things that have happened within Black and Brown communities, but then we talk about what happened in the family level. So we take it from this historical context to the familial context. What has happened in those families? What has happened into those neighborhoods? And how has this intergenerational history of trauma impacted our young people? And so, why is this important? This is important because we know that adverse childhood experiences can have long-term negative impacts on health, opportunity, and well-being. It's like your opportunities around your education, your employment opportunities, your housing opportunities, and your healthcare are all impacted by ACEs. And so we know that adverse childhood experiences are common, and some groups experience them more than others. And I kind of talked about the groups first off when I talked about like the African American community and our connection. Um, Part of what we need to do first is educate the community and seek policy change. Like people need to understand like the correlation between, ACEs and some of these other social and structural determinants of health and behavioral determinants of health. Like how are these things impacted by how you live, the things that you have experienced where you live. And for me, looking at the racial impact and how it has impacted communities, we have to look at how new policies that looked at the cumulative impact of ACEs that strengthen individual coping in the face of adversity, that enhance family relations and resilience, that promotes community to reduce ACEs exposure in communities of concern. Like, how do we make communities a haven for people who are experiencing? And so for me, I think that part of this is like telling our stories. And so I'm not here by happenstance. I'm here through this whole series of traumatic experiences. And so this picture to the left is myself. The baby is me. I was about 9 months old, probably a little bit before 12 before I was 1 year old. That is my mom, who would have celebrated her 76th birthday on the 18th, and my little brother David. In the middle is my mom, and if you look at me, kind of look like her, but she's a little tiny something. But for the first time ever, I'm showing y'all a picture of my father. Um, this was in my brother's belongings, and so my baby brother, who was a baby in this picture, recently passed away, and so this picture was in his belongings, and my uncle brought it to me, and so this was like happier times in our family. So I was the same girl with the unkept hair that nobody wanted to tackle it. But my father, if I look at this picture, I see my brother. And so I see a person that, seems to be happy and jovial and loving his family. But, part of the telling the story is that my father was an abuser. My father murdered my mom when she was 24 years old. He was 26 years old. They had been divorced. And so during that time, not only did I lose my mother, but I lost my father. And that disproportionately impacted not only my life, but the life of my brother. And so I remember at some point, over the course of my brother passing away, where I thought, I had always looked at the trauma as impacting me. And I think that all of us look at things and say, it's about me. But then I look back at the course of my brother's life and I'm like, my trauma was his trauma. Like we lived through the same things. And so, even though it may seem like I was a little bit more resilient, I see it in like my relationships, the things, that went on. And then I saw the similarities between his personality and my personality, um, toward the end of his life, that we had very similar things in common. And that he would ask questions at the hospital about, so how tall do you think our younger brother would have been had he lived? So my younger brother he was murdered when he was 15 in a racial incident. And so we think about the issues that impacted my family, and that's just my family. And so my family, and then the larger community, like how did it impact us, myself and my brothers? How did it impact my grandmother and my grandfather? How did it impact my aunts and my uncles? And so if you look at it, looking at these things around this intergenerational thing and this familial thing, is that one trauma impacts a lot of people, right? And so her friends were also impacted. So think about that when we're thinking about some of these things that we've seen in the news. We've seen the things around Tamir Rice. We know that his sister, came to his aid. We think about the 15-year-old that was killed in a racial incident was my brother. 24-year-old was my mom. We had a Warrensville Heights mom who was killed in front of her teenage daughter. Trayvon Martin's friend who was on the phone with him. Um, the Minneapolis girl who was two, who witnessed the murder of her mom, the Chicago boy that I will never forget. This was probably 30, 40 years ago. Yummy Sanderford, who was lured to his death by teens after participating in a drive-by shooting. Reading his story and remembering not only him, but his name all of these years. And why did they call him Yummy? They called him Yummy because he liked candy. Um, and that his grandmother, he had been raising by his grandparents, his grandmother, after his mom had lost custody of her children because of drug abuse. And so in the United States, we know that nearly half to one-third of youth experience at least one ACE by the age of 18. Half, that's a lot of young people. And so when we talk about certain neighborhoods, it's more than half. It's every single child. I've literally been in schools where every child raised their hand and said that they've had a friend die or somebody that is really close to them that had been murdered. And so when we think about the areas that are impacted the most, I could take this map and use any map in the country of areas that were redlined. And so the areas that are impacted the most are the areas that were redlined. These are areas that are impacted the most because when we look at those red line areas, those are areas that have more environmental hazards. They have less quality education, particularly when we talk about this disparaging school funding formula and how schools are funded and whether mental health is funded. I travel a lot, and so one of the things about my travel is I get a chance to see how other people live. What do they do in schools? What do they do about trauma? And so when I was in Hawaii not too long ago, I passed this room and I looked at it, and it had peace room. And so when I walked to the door and I looked in, and it was like a room that had like pillows on the floor, and the rooms were painted blue and kind of looked like the water. And it was a place for students to go and be able to calm down. But we know in the inner city, we don't have peace rooms. What we have is police officers. And so when you talk about impacted communities, and we talk about what goes on. We talk about the ACEs traumas are forms of physical, Emotional abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. They generally include physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, emotional and physical neglect, living with a family with mental health or substance abuse issues, witnessing domestic violence, or witnessing a murder, sudden separation from a loved one, literally children being pulled from what they think is their only connection to anything. And usually it's like a nighttime, take you away. Um, Poverty, looking at the poverty rates and remembering that map that I talked to you about earlier, and looking at like when we look at children that are experiencing ACEs, about 19.5% are experiencing poverty. And this might be an old statistic because right now we have a lot more families that are disproportionately impacted because of the cuts with this administration. When we talk about racism and discrimination, violence in the community, think about where people live at. Think about the violence that impacts their communities, where you're hearing police all day long or all night long. Um, on the weekends, you have all of these things that are going on. Families that have experienced divorce. Usually, what happens after the divorce is women are usually in a situation where they have less income. And so so they may have lived in a middle class neighborhood. Children may have lived in a middle class neighborhood, and now all of a sudden, all of that changes because mom doesn't have the income that she had when she lived with dad. And so the things that they experience as a direct result of divorce, violence against your mother. So in ACEs, witnessing violence against a parent, particularly a female parent, mental illness. We kind of just kind of overlook the impact around mental illness and what role it plays when we're talking about ACEs and trauma. But we have to make sure that mental health services are available for not only children that have experienced ACEs, but also adults who are having these recurring situations around ACEs that happened to them as a youth. Having a relative who has been sent to jail or prison. Think about our cradle to prison pipeline. We have lots of young people who have relatives, particularly fathers, who have been sent to prison. Um, and so, looking at also the effects of adverse childhood experience, people who live through ACEs trauma will often struggle as adults. Trauma increases your risk of depression, substance abuse, and can lead to more aggressive behaviors in adulthood. And it says, looking at alcohol and drug abuse, which also increases your risk of smoking. In the city of Cleveland, in Cleveland, Ohio, we have some of the highest smoking rates in the country. 30% of adults in the city of Cleveland smoke. 30%, not 3%, 30%, which is alarming because in West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Kentucky, which are like the areas that we kind of compare ourselves to, their smoking rates are about 11%. And so we are doing a poor, poor job of addressing the impact of mentholated products on African American communities. Looking at depression. Um, we live in the Midwest, and part of the Midwest is, we have long periods of time where we don't have a lot of sun. And so when we have people who have experienced ACEs, and then we also have this lack of sunlight, we kind of see a lot more issues around violence in the wintertime or in times when we don't have a lot of sun. Remember, we've had a lot of rain, and so with that, we've seen a lot of other cases. Leading a more sedentary lifestyle, which leads to obesity, employment opportunities where people can't keep a job because, they're like angry and they have lots of issues. And we're not just talking about adults, we're talking about young people too. So like I had some young people who were working with us last summer. And for the first time, I had young people who were working for me that I could not keep them in my employment because they had these mood swings, screaming in the middle of your workday, walking around with headphones on. Us trying to walk through these issues that are going on and not really understanding the issues, saying, okay, well, we got to bring a counselor in here to talk with them. And then they're bringing their supervisor in, who is also a younger woman. And I think she was having just as many problems as they were. And then looking at other health issues, looking at diabetes, our cancer rates, heart disease and stroke, which are directly tied to this whole thing around alcohol and drug abuse. And as you'll see later, tied directly to lead poisoning. Also a higher risk of contracting a sexually transmitted disease or a sexually transmitted infection. And we also see these attempted suicides and completed suicides at a higher rate for children and young people who have experienced ACEs. And so I talked to you a little bit about my family earlier around this lifetime of pain, but just break this down. So on this couch on the left side, there are four children and my mom. My mom is not here. My brother, who's sitting right beside me, is no longer here. 57 years old. Um, and gone. My other uncle, who was sitting right beside my mom, who is my mom's youngest brother, he was absolutely impacted by her death because he was very close to his big sister, and they almost dropped him in the casket. And he actually like went through a lot of things over the years. And then the other baby who is one of my younger brothers who's also had some mental health issues and some other things over the years. But then we look at the larger couch because all of us got these couch picture. If you grew up in the 70s, you got a picture sitting on somebody's couch. And so the baby with the bottle is my youngest brother. He's no longer here. It is my uncle. It is my second youngest brother, myself, my brother who's no longer here, my cousin who's younger than my brother, who is no longer here, and my cousin Trina. And so think about the lifetime impact of a single death did to all of these children that are sitting on the couch. Those are your family. So take your picture and substitute it for my picture and look at the number of families who are disproportionately impacted. Um, and so we talk about childhood poverty and ACEs. And so we talk about these three strikes. People who live with a higher incidence of ACEs are more likely to drop out of high school or not complete high school, be unemployed or underemployed, live in a household below the poverty level. Looking at 1 in 6 adults who experience four or more types of ACEs, looking at least five of the top 10 leading causes of deaths are associated ACEs. And I talked to you about it before, which is heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes. Preventing ACEs could reduce the number of adults with depression by as much as 44%. Less 44%. And so these are the things that are measured, right? And so think about the people that aren't measured, the people that aren't in these metrics anywhere. And so think about the role that racism has also played when we talk about racial discrimination and adverse childhood experiences, looking at discrimination and representing prevalent ACEs among Black youth that can be detected among youth as young as 6 years old, having children who are experiencing racism as young as 6 years old and how it impacts their mind, their growing mind. Alarmingly, Black adolescents report the average of 5 encounters of racial discrimination per day. But for us, for all of us, comes as no surprise that depression and anxiety are among the most pronounced mental health problems associated with racial discrimination among Black youth. Um, and so when we talk about these unresolved trauma and ACEs, the reason why ACEs create so much havoc in our lives due to unresolved trauma, trauma changes who you are on the inside. It alters your nervous system. It sticks with you. They haunt you and it makes it difficult to ignore or push them away, right? It causes mental and emotional damage. Even though you are an adult, deep down inside, you still carry the child who was scarred and scared. And that's what I saw with my brother. My brother and I literally at the hospital were 2 6-year-olds recounting what happened to us in 1974 without the words as a 50, both of us were, we're 9 months apart, 58 years old, 57 years old at the time. So both of us are sitting there and we're remembering our lives. Um, this is how the body tries to protect you. This is in the background, unnoticed until memories come back in the form of flashbacks or anxieties. And so thinking about what happened. And so as we're talking about these determinants of health and we talk about ACEs, we have to understand that when we talk about these foundations that were built on racism, they were not created to address the issues that are disproportionately impacting our community. And so if you look at any of those systems, so if you look at our healthcare and our healthcare system, even supposed to be our health and our healthcare system, our healthcare systems aren't created to address ACEs. And you're like, how can healthcare systems not be addressed that to created to address ACEs? Like they're not addressed to look at the mental health needs of the community. They're just dressed to like, well, let's put a Band-Aid on whatever we think may be ailing you. And so you can't put a Band-Aid on mental pain. And so looking at family, society, individual, community, and then all of these other structures and how they're made up. How am I doing for time, y'all? Um, Environmental toxins common in urban environments contribute to cognitive outcomes that associate with the environment and child nurturing. The relationship between ACEs and environmental exposures reveals adverse outcomes, right? And so that means these adverse outcomes are learning disabilities, lowered IQ, memory and attention problems, and overall poor educational outcomes by environmental toxins. This is why. The definition of lead poisoning. Lead poisoning or lead toxicity is a serious condition that occurs when a child is around high levels of lead. Exposure to lead may come from a variety of sources. Old lead-based paint is where it's most common. We have a lot of people who have porches that need to be repainted and they have old paint that are there. So those old chips cause lead dust. And so usually those chips are near windows where they have old windows and old infrastructure in their houses. Because remember, in urban communities, we still live in relatively old homes. In the city of Cleveland, 90% of in most urban areas, 90% of the homes were built before 1978. Okay. Lead poisoning often affects children who live in older houses with peeling paint or lead pipes. Um, and then lead poisoning, when we talk about ACEs, lead is a neurotoxin that can cause educational disabilities, behavioral changes, and organ failure. I'm letting y'all know there is no safe level of lead exposure at all. Lead zero, no safe numbers. It can cause learning disabilities, behavioral problems, seizures. In extreme cases, it can cause death. So I remember being out doing a community conversation, and there was a young woman who said, you know, I used to play with this girl all the time. She lived next door, and then all of a sudden she disappeared. And then finally, when I got a little older, my parents said she didn't disappear, she died. She died because she was severely lead poisoned. And so this woman was like 60, 70 years old, and she was like it was freshly happening to her. But she said, I played with her every day. And then all of a sudden she wasn't there anymore. And so lead is particularly dangerous to children under the age of 6 because of their growing bodies. Why their bodies absorb more lead than adults, and their developing brains and nervous systems are more sensitive to the lead's damaging effects. So it's not that lead doesn't impact adults. So don't get me wrong. If you're an adult and you can still be exposed to lead, except for your brain is already developed. But when we're talking about the developing brain and lead poisoning in children, that is one of the main issues that we looked at. Childhood lead exposure is manifest in adults by increased risk of heart, kidney disease, dementia, and diabetes. And I think most people don't know that. And so I talk about these whole links to all of these things because nobody talks to us about we got all these dialysis centers in the hood because of lead poisoning. 95% of adults in the United States have lead in their body. It's just where it decides to land, right? And so when we start looking at hypertension, directly tied to lead poisoning, kidney failure, directly tied to lead poisoning, dementia, directly tied to childhood lead poisoning, diabetes, directly tied to lead poisoning. Um, and that's why if you ever hear the mayor of Cleveland say lead poisoning is public enemy number one, that's because I told him that because lead poisoning is public enemy number one because it impacts every single system that we have. It impacts our educational systems, our employment opportunities, our health and healthcare systems, and our housing. So when we look at all of these things, lead is dangerous to us. Where is it? Soil near our roadways, near older houses, near industrial sites, in herbal remedies and medicine. So a lot of times we may do some herbal remedies that are coming from overseas. A lot of things that are coming from overseas have lead in them because lead is a heavy metal, and because things are measured and you get money according to the weight, they'll put lead in it in order for it to have a higher weight. But the other thing that lead does really well is lead makes stuff look shiny and cute. And so when I was in Dubai and I looked at saffron stands, saffron is not red. No, no, no. Saffron is a brownish kind of color. Well, it looks red when you put a lot of lead in it because the lead makes it look more appetizing. And so I literally could walk through those things and go, yep, well, I ain't buying that. Yep, ain't gonna buy that because I knew. Looking at toys and candies that come from outside the United States, that those toys are, the colors on them are usually used with lead-based paint, and lead-based paint is still sold. Sherwin-Williams Dutch Boy brands that's sold overseas still has lead in it. Why that has not been banned, I do not know. But Dutch Boy brand paints from Sherwin-Williams, which is based here in Cleveland, um, is still they still sell lead-based paint. Stained glass. Stained glass, if you've seen these beautiful stained glass windows and stained glass pieces, a lot of lead in stained glass. Leaded crystal and crystal glassware, a lot of lead in those pieces also, particularly the older pieces. Glazed ceramic ware, including pitchers, plates, cups. And so like if you have cups that you bought from like the dollar store, like people buy stuff all the time. And if it chips or if it breaks, throw it away. Because what happens is the lead will leach into your food because of the chipping and cracking. And so what lead does to your food is lead makes your food taste sweet. Lead tastes sweet like candy, and that's why children are so attracted to it. Um, Imported spices. If you've been watching the news, you've seen that we've had a lot of recalls on cinnamon. Cinnamon is one of those imported spices that they use in a lot of applesauce. And so we had a recall on children's applesauce, the ones that are like the squeezy kind of bottle things that the kids use. And it wasn't the recall on the applesauce. The recall was on the cinnamon in the applesauce because of the high levels of lead that were in the cinnamon. What lead does is no amount of lead in a child's body is safe. I'm going to keep telling y'all that because no matter what I say, remember that no amount is safe. Even low levels of lead in children can affect the organs and systems of their body. It can include developmental delays, behavioral problems, learning disabilities, attention deficits, growth delay, hearing problems, behavior problems, sound like ACEs. Um, high blood levels, lead levels can cause seizures and comas, and in rare cases can be fatal. Um, what it does for adults, and I don't know why the stuff moved on this side. I saved it and stuff moved. Lead poisoning in adults can also lead to serious health effects. These effects can include, and I'm going to keep going over them, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, reproductive issues. So when we look at this maternal and infant mortality crisis that we're like, we have a maternal and infant mortality crisis in the United States, it's directly tied to lead poisoning. It's directly tied to lead poisoning. And the lead poisoning is directly tied to poverty. Um, and now this lead and crime hypothesis. There is substantial evidence linking lead exposure to a heightened risk of criminal behavior, particularly violent crimes. And that's because of what lead does to the brain, what it does to the nervous system, what it does to our young people. And so this is this tree. So when we look at our environments, cultivate our communities, and our communities nurture our health. And so we look at these two trees. We see a tree that is dying. And then we see another tree that is flourishing. And it says when inequities are high and community assets are low, health outcomes are worse. But when inequities are low and community assets are high, outcomes are best. And so it's not that we don't see lead poisoning in the suburbs. It's that they have the things that they need in order for them to combat some of the impacts around lead. And so one of them is nutrition. Nutrition is a game changer when we talk about lead. Being able to have nutritious food, to be able to eat fruits and vegetables, have access to fruits and vegetables, access to beans and greens. I sound like my grandmother right now. Those things are important because those things actually help remove lead from your system. Not only do they not only remove lead from your system, but one of the bigger things that helps to remove lead from your system is cilantro. Cilantro. And so I told people, because their kids like Chipotle. When you go to Chipotle, make sure that you get your cilantro. I think it's called the cilantro lime, that the limes, the cilantro rice. The rice has cilantro in it because cilantro is something that does help remove the lead. And so looking at these trees and saying, what are some of the things that are going on over here, and what are some of the things that are going over here that can be changed in urban communities. So how do we help urban communities to be able to grow? And part of that is to make sure that we increase the ability to assets for those communities because we pay taxes. And so it's like, how do we pay so much in taxes, but our communities are still at a deficit? And part of that is challenging these administrations to not put so much money in policing our communities, but put more efforts into um, the other issues that are impacting our communities, right? And so when you look at cities whose gross domestic income comes to 45, 46, 50% of their budgets are going to policing, then that means that all of those things that you really, really need to increase to help with the health outcomes of your communities aren't there. And I'm talking about Cleveland. 50% of our budget went to policing, y'all. And I'm like been having offense since then. The dark side of coping, looking at unresolved trauma, um, people use drugs, alcohol, and other addictions to numb themselves from the pain. Your life feels out of control. You can't seem to shake the feeling. And for many people, remembering that this is not your fault. You are not to blame for being exposed to ACEs. The impact of those experiences linger for years. And so we have to understand that, counseling isn't a one and done, that is something that, we have to do for a lifetime. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Many children who experience trauma go on to lead relatively normal lives, but in others, there is hope. The mind says it is hopeless, but therapy offers an opportunity. Seeking out trauma treatment or trauma-informed care is important. Being able to go talk to somebody about the things that you are feeling, and then I have to go back to this whole thing around health equity because, we got these systems that don't want to talk about health equity. And so health equity is achieved when every person has the opportunity to attain his or her full potential, full potential. And no one is disadvantaged from achieving this potential because of their social position or other socially determined circumstances. And that will be ACEs. ACEs is a socially determined circumstance. What do we need to change? We need to change how people think about the cause of ACEs. We need to shift the focus from the individual responsibility to community solutions. We need to reduce the stigma around seeking help with parenting challenges. And like I said, I just talked to my team and said, listening to the person who's in charge of HHS and it will remain nameless, who says, well, Black children need to be reparented. And I'm like, huh? We should be alarmed, okay? Um, we need to reduce the stigma around seeking help. We need to promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments where children live, learn, and play. ACEs, we need to change their policies to include racism and lead. So as we're talking about ACEs, ACEs should be talking about racism and lead because of who's impacted disproportionately by ACEs. We need to make sure we're looking at progressive leadership. We need to change the school funding formula today. Like there should be not a school open that does not have a peace room in the inner city. Like we should be having more peace rooms and less police officers. We need to pay a livable wage to community members. Like we need to make sure that people are able to afford a place to stay, a stable place to stay. We need to train more Black male therapists and teachers, and we need equitable kinship funding. If parents and grandparents have their grandkids, we need to make sure that it's funded on par with everything else. And we need to understand this. This came from the Kerner Commission report that was released in February of 1968. Um, White Americans can never fully understand, but what the Negro can never forget is that white society is deeply implicated in a ghetto. In other words, white institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. And so that is what we see when we talk about ACEs, the condoning of the things that are going on within our communities. And I am Ivanka Hall, the Executive Director of the nationally recognized Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ivanka, for sharing your family story and for sharing strategies that are designed to help families thrive. At this time, do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, this is Yaya. I don't have any questions. I just have a comment. Everything that you just said to me has motivated me to aggravate. I like that word you said, aggravate a system that is failing my granddaughter. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments, please,
Hi,
please ask.
hi, Ivanka. Very excellent. I can't, that's the only word I can use for your presentation. It's excellent. When we talk about the lead, effects of the lead, are there tests that doctors, pediatricians, doctors can do like early on in a child's, their continuum of care that can identify how much lead, what kind of percentage of lead is there, and then, to follow up with that, how can that be, what are the remedial aspects of trying to deal with that?
First off, the whole thing around lead and lead testing. The whole thing,
Uh-huh.
first off, is about lead and lead testing. What we want people to know is that here in the state of Ohio, less than 40% of children are tested at their doctor's office. Did y'all know that? Most people think that when they take their child in for a well child visit, that their children are automatically tested for lead, particularly before they start school. We test children, children are supposed to be tested by the time they're 6 years old, because by the time they're 6 years old, the lead starts settling in other places, right? So the lead goes from your blood, and then it goes to your bones, and then it goes into your other organs. So that means that by the time you're 6 years old, it is settled in other places. The other is that all WIC areas and departments are not created equal. All WIC departments in Ohio used to do lead testing for children, starting at 3 months old. So every time you would take your child for a WIC appointment, they would test them, right? That stopped. In Cuyahoga County, WIC does not do lead testing for children. I don't think they do it in Columbus. They do it in Akron. And so we need to change that. Like WIC needs to test every single child that comes there. Because one of the things we know about WIC is that every poor child gets WIC. If you poor, you get WIC. You qualify for WIC. Hands down, everybody. If you don't have the dollars, you can qualify for WIC. And so when your mom is taking you for a WIC appointment, not only should you be getting a lead test, but you should also be getting information. The other is that the lead number should be zero, zero. And so when I talk about there's no safe level, that means that if they tell you, oh, well, your child only tested and it's only one, and they're like, oh, that's good, and it's like, no, it's not, because it should be zero. Um, in the state of Ohio, it says, oh, we're not even looking at it until it goes above 10. 10 is high. That's a lot of lead. And so the other thing, the great equalizer is around food. Like I talked about this whole thing around food, and I know there's some things, that a lot of people don't like to cook anymore, and a lot of children are eating a lot of fast food every single day. But there are no nutritional values in McDonald's, Burger King, in burgers or fries. And so I actually literally wrote legislation and went to the city council to ask them to just like, remember when we used to get order pop for our kids with a kids meal, and now you can't, right? We made that a national thing where it's like, well, you can't order a pop at all in a kids meal. You get juice, milk, or water. Like that's your pick. You get the three things, but you can't get a pop with a kids meal. I want the kids' meal to include a healthy option, which is a side salad, because we know that if we offer a side salad to parents, that their kids are going to eat it, that they're going to actually order it, because we know that if we have an opportunity to have something healthy for our children, that we're going to choose the healthier side. And so when I went to City Council and asked them about doing these healthy side options, like to put that in as legislation, one of the council people said I was a fat kid, and I'm like, who cares? Like, I'm not talking about that. Like, we're trying to save kids. Like, your job, as a council representative should be all about saving kids. It shouldn't be about your story about whether you was a fat kid. So it's, how do we make sure that our legislators understand the issues? And if they don't understand the issues, that you hold press conferences in the middle of City Hall, which I do all the time. I take over City Hall and bring everybody with me, because I think that it's important for us to advocate for our children. When I first started doing this work 32 years ago, we would go into meetings and they would say, and Lisa probably remembers this too, make sure that you tell them this will be the first generation that won't live as long as their parents. But what they didn't tell me is that was me. I'm the first generation. Generation X. I'm the first generation that won't live as long as my parents. That is ridiculous. That is ridiculous. Like we should not be doing this. And and at the end, our children are living less than, shorter lives than we are. But definitely, making sure that you're talking to the doctor. If you're taking your child to a well child visit, that as soon as you go in that office and they go in to take the blood pressure or do whatever they're doing the intake, that you say, I want a lead test for my child. If your child is under 6, if they're over 6, they can't do one, because it's settled somewhere else. But if they're under 6 years old, making sure that you say, make sure you add a lead test to that. Um, and that'll be important because, like I said, only 40% of children in the state of Ohio are actually getting a test at their well child visit. And people don't know it. They just think, automatically, well child visit, you're going to do everything that you're supposed to do. And that's not how it works.
And that would probably go for adults too. When you go for your own physical or checkup, yearly checkup, you should probably be asking about it being tested for lead.
Well, you can't be as an adult. So as an
Oh,
adult,
okay.
because it is now settled into your organs, the
Mm.
damage is there. And that's why I talked so much about the food, because the great equalizer, even for adults, is food, because the food will help take some of the lead out of your system, but the neurological impact, like the impacts that are there, are going to be there with you forever. And
Mm.
so, that's a biggie. Trying to let people know, like looking at all the number of people that we have in our communities that have dementia and tying that directly to lead poisoning. Looking at the dialysis centers. Y'all know how many dialysis centers are in urban communities? Like literally everywhere. And they're not there because Black people and brown people don't know how to eat healthy. No, they're there because of the impact of lead in your system as a child. And so when we talk about like dementia, when we talk about hypertension, as we're talking about all of those things, we cannot negate the impact around lead. And as we're talking about ACEs, we cannot negate the impact around ACEs and children with lead poisoning. There is a direct correlation between ACEs and children with lead poisoning.
So, Ivanka, for many of the people who are on this call, their grandparents, aunts, cousins, others who are caring for relative children who may be just getting to school age, but in all likelihood are probably school age. So we're talking first through 12th grade. So for those children that are age 6 and they can't do the testing any longer, but they're having issues in school, and the school is saying, well, okay, their behavior problem. We need to give them some type of diagnosis and put them in some room or something. What should families be trying to do to address the situation? Because if it's already in the organs, if it starts to settling in the organs after age 6, and you can't identify, how do they go back, or how do families on this call and other kinship families and other families in general go back to try and address the issue for their children? Because we see our children being placed in what they call special needs
Mhm.
classes, and oftentimes that's just the catchphrase for anytime they don't want to deal with issues that children are having. And so how would you begin to try and address that? Do you have any ideas, any thoughts?
So there are a couple things. So one of them is, um, you can still like, I don't know if they can get access to their children's files from before they got them. Or, if their child is severely poisoned, then if they test them, it'll come up because it's so much that it hasn't reached all of it hasn't reached the bones yet. The other is that, if it's after those ages, then, food. The bigger part of it is like you won't be able to go in and test, um but unless they look at it and see that it's really really high, then they may talk about like, are there some other treatments that can happen with that child. But the other would be food is a great equalizer, like those green drinks that you see all these adults walking around here with. You get them for your kids, like kale, like make it tempting for them. Like you can put apple juice and things like that in it that'll make it. But those things help take the lid out. And then it'll actually, if you see them eating it over a time period, you'll actually see that they have like a calmer disposition, because it's starting to take some of the other things out. Like giving them if your school doesn't have a peace room, you know, having, hey, parents, we still have PTAs, no matter how much they try to take them away. You know, can we create a room that's a peace room for children to go into? Or if that's a room that's like the suspension, in-house suspension or whatever room, can we change the color of this room? Can we make it in a place where it can be more relaxing to kids, giving them other things to help kind of like stimulate the brain and help them to diffuse some of the things that are going on because now it's all those neuron receptors are kind of going crazy, right? And so they're like, because once something happens, they go from like 0 to 300 like really fast. And so it's like, how do you do things where you can help children to calm down? And so for in our society, we think that bringing police presence make people calm down, but it doesn't. Police presence make people even pissed off even more. And it does the same thing for children because now children are like going through this fight or flight thing. And so they're like, if they were mad, they're even madder, right? And so, like, how do we using nutrition is the biggest thing. Going to the doctor and saying, is it other things that you can prescribe, like other vitamins, that you can provide to prescribe for the child? Is there other types of tests we can do? Can we get the child into a counselor? And so so when we look at lead poisoning, we look at ADHD, ADD, ACEs, and autism. Autism is one of the things that have been misdiagnosed that's actually for many children is lead poisoning. They're not autistic. They're severely lead poisoned. And so looking at those things and saying like how do we work with the schools, like even going into the schools and seeing what your kids are eating for lunch, you know, and saying, okay, look, schools, can we talk to y'all about having some healthier options for these young people? Because, schools can pick what they want for their kids. Making, that kind of observation. And then fighting with these school boards. We have most of the time we have elected or appointed school board members and saying to them, there are some other things that needs to happen within the schools that can be beneficial. But for the most part, too, going to pediatricians who don't really understand about lead poisoning, they don't. Like there have been many that I've gone into a room to talk about, and when I start talking about the things that I know about lead, and that lead is sweet like candy, and they're like, huh? Don't even know it, or like clay pots or broken, you got a cup that got a chip on it, and you heating up stuff in the microwave. That the lead is leaching out into your drink or into your food. People don't think about that. And so thinking about it in a whole different way, because we have a lot of lead in urban communities. We have legacy lead that's here from old gas stations. We have older homes that have been torn down. And so when they start digging to build new homes, what happens is all of the lead that was there in the ground is now airborne. When they would tear down malls and shopping plazas and all those other things, all this old infrastructure, all these old infrastructures have a lot of lead in them. So when they tear down stuff in your community, they're supposed to be tearing it down with a water hose following it. Like you're not supposed to tear down stuff and the water is not following it because they're not doing any EPA wetted standards. And if they're not doing wetted standards, that means that all of that lead dust is now going to be in your house. The other thing for parents, if you got carpet, take it out. Go back to what we used to before we thought we had some money, which, when we got money, we got carpet. Go back to basics, get rid of the carpet. Carpet holds lead in the fibers. And what happens is when children are learning how to walk and they're crawling on the floor, all of that lead that's down in those fibers, they're kicking it up. And it's like right in their face. So that means that all of a sudden they start having issues and now they want to get on the floor and they want to get on the floor all the time. You're like, why do they want to get down there? And they want to get down there because they want to go to where the sweet was. So they want to go back to wherever the source was. So wherever they found it, that's where they're going to keep going. So if it was near a window, they're going to keep going by that window. If it's on the floor, they're going to keep going to the floor. And so for me, I tell people take the carpets, take the carpets up, the old windows, if you have the means to be able to replace them. And that's why, I think that kinship care families should be getting more support, because a lot of people are living in older homes and it costs a lot to replace windows. But windows, changing out windows and taking up carpet can do, a lot of help with it in your home. And then keeping like flower beds and things near your door with like native flowers and things like that. Where you don't have a lot of dust coming into your house. This is what I tell everybody. I grew up with my grandparents. My grandmother would have been 95 years old had she lived, right? You can walk in her house with your shoes,
Hmm.
right? And guess why? Because she didn't want everything from outside in her house. And guess why that's important for us now? Because outside is lead. And so all that lead comes in your house with your shoes. So, old people got it right. Take them shoes off when you come in this house. You're not going to be walking around my house with your shoes on. And so, just going back for us, Black people going back to basics.
Ivanka, outside of your organization, are there any organizations that are giving specific information about lead poisoning and how people can advocate what they need to, who they need to contact, how they need to contact? We talk about advocating all the time with our caregivers, and this is a specific uh, topic that would require having the knowledge that you have and given to us. But is there organizations that sort of outline what you can do, who you can go to, who you need to go to advocate for changes?
So I also co-founded another organization, and I've done that in the past, co-founded other organizations, and one of them is Clash. And so Clash has a website that has things that are available. I'm going to tell you the website where they have like if you have to go to court or if you have um, other things that are going on that you can go and get the things that you need. But it's I want to say it's Clash Cleve. But it's Clash. It's Cleveland-led Advocates for Safe Housing, um, is the name of the organization. And let me see if the email will pop up. It is Clash Cleve, Clash, hold it, I'm gonna type it in the thing. Sorry, y'all. We, and then that way you can go on there and get other information.
Thank you.
Right.
I,
And that information should be for anybody, for any place that you live at, because it has the basic information about lead. It talks about some of the whole historical pieces around lead. It talks about the advocacy around housing. And then it talks about like some of the other things that we can do. But there's definitely this lead and crime hypothesis. I actually brought in a specialist from New Mexico. So in New Mexico, they had done this study about crime in Mexico. And they were like, is the crime tied directly to like this old stock housing that we have? They have the adobe houses. And so they went back in and they did this correlation and discovered that definitely, definitely, definitely that there is a lead and crime hypothesis. And so where we see, high rates of lead poisoning, we see high rates of crime also.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Okay, if not, we will proceed with the announcement of the winner of the gift certificate.
okay. It looks like we have a new participant that joined us today. I believe I'm going to try to pronounce it correctly. Kalilia Stringfield. She's indicated she is a caregiver. And so, Kalilia, we will make sure that I get information from you about your about receiving the $50 gift card for attending today. And thank you, and thank everybody else for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for attending today. We hope you have an awesome day. It's beautiful outside, a little chilly, but it's still beautiful. Have a great day.
Thank you.